Suitor on a Monday on the Cage. Oh, is that I've been vaccinated? Is that confirmed?
Yeah, you saw it on Twitter. I know you did, but I had to once again just show the sticker. I got a sticker. I felt like I was back in grade school getting the sticker once I got through and got my first vaccination. The wife did as well. So, honestly, I sat in that chair, DT, thinking, I don't know. Everyone has a right to their own opinion, but thank you to the medical pros. Thank you to the scientists that have come up with this and got us on the path back to normalcy, because that's what I felt like when I was sitting in the chair. A little bit of hope.
Yeah.
Okay. It feels good to take a step towards back to normal.
Well, an incredibly small sacrifice in the grand scheme of things for your fellow man. I like the thought of it. On a tangent, we'll talk John Chick a little later in the show after Suits is gone. Hey, when social media is not being terrible is during the draft and the post-draft and the pre-draft, and I love all the talk around the draft. What are they going to do? What did they do? How did they do? You are not a fan. I'm going to need you to explain why. You are not a fan of grading drafts and draft picks immediately after the fact. Why is that?
Well, there's a couple of topics of discussion that I put under the category of I understand why they happen. And I get when people feel cool about wanting to be sort of the GM. I'm going to pretend to be the GM today, and I'm going to pick my team, or I'm going to rate the players that are in the draft and take a look at their strengths and weaknesses and how would I do it in mock drafts. I totally understand why people get into it and they pick their fantasy teams and things like that. All of that I get, but to me, it's sort of under the umbrella of, such an unperfect science. It's such a uncertainty when it comes to statistically what happens when you go through a draft. And it doesn't matter what league. It doesn't matter how much money you put into it. It doesn't matter how many scouts you have. It is so uncertain to try and evaluate a player that has to take another major step from college to pro football on either side of the border, from college to pro football, to try and predict which players will be successful and which won't is virtually impossible. We have tons of examples of first picks overall that become busts, and guys who didn't even get drafted that walk on and try out, like the Rob Bagg story, that become stars on your team. So there's so many examples. For every great number one decision, there are 5th round decisions that work out better than your number one pick. So when I look at the numbers and the history of it, I just put it under the category of, I get why people like it, but I don't really play that speculation game to say this player is going to make it coming out of college and this player won't. And I don't like to prejudge either. When guys say, well, if that kid played in NCAA, then he's going to make it in the CFL. And if that kid played in U Sports, then, well, he might not. So I'm not going to draft him as quite as high and all that. Man, you are now prejudging a quality athlete that you really can't measure one thing that's most important: the level of his motivation.
Right.
When he gets onto the field and he's trying out, how badly does he want it? Because if there's a U Sport guy that wants it way more than the guy that played at USC or UCLA or Alabama, and this is just kind of a step down for him to come to a Canadian camp, well, then the U Sport guy is going to be better and he's going to make the team.
Isn't these, like, 3 Down Nation will do one, and CFL will probably do one of, hey, here, or TSN will probably do one of, hey, here's our evaluation of who the Riders took at number 2, B+. Isn't that just exactly what GMs are doing? Like, they're trying to project, what is Nelson Lacombo going to be in the CFL? Okay, we're going to take him number 2 because we believe this. That's what GMs are doing. So why can't we do it for fun?
Well, you can.
It's just fun.
You can't. Yeah, you can, DT. You absolutely can. And that's what I mean. You put yourself in the GM's see,
Yeah.
you put his,
And
you
you
put
set
his hat on, and
signposts
you
for
have
yourself.
fun trying to speculate. But let me give you some numbers that back up what I'm saying.
Hit me.
20 years, I look back at the rider picks and the first 2 picks in the last 20 years. So that's a lot of different regimes, a lot of different general managers. And you look back at the players in those first 2 rounds, first 2 picks, there were 40 of them. And I went back and looked at probably 6 of the 40, so 15%, that became stars. Andy Fantus,
Okay.
in 06, Keith Sholigan in 08. I put Luca Conji in there because good kicker in 06, Scott Schultz in 01, Mike McCullough in 03. And I even put Ben Heaton, and Ben Heaton didn't have a long career, but he was that guy. So of those 6 players, there were other players that I looked at that were good, and maybe if they played longer or they got a different opportunity and all those things. But the guys who really established themselves and became stars in the league with the Saskatchewan Roughriders, of their picks, the 40 of them, only 6 became big stars. There were a few that went and played on other teams and became big stars, like Nick Dembski, as you mentioned earlier. Cam Judge is most recent. Craig Butler was another great safety that went and played in Hamilton for years, but was drafted by the Riders. So, there's a few of those guys too. But when you look at that, I'm not diminishing the quality of the player. I'm just expressing the uncertainty there is when it comes to professional scouts that are ranking these players, trying to determine who's going to make the team and who isn't going to make the team, is almost really just a guessing game. I put more weight. I put more weight in the interview almost, and trying to read the motivation. It's all risk analysis, but reading the motivation level of a player and his family background, to me, is going to be almost, well, certainly equally as important, but maybe even more important than his 40 times and how much he benches. Every single guy in the draft is going to be a good athlete and a good football player.
Yeah. The draft is so interesting in the way the CFL draft, there have been extensive studies on the NFL draft and how it is essentially random, and there's no GM who's better than any other GM when you really put it through the wash. The CFL draft, they have to deal with so many other factors that other drafts don't have to deal with. Is this guy going to the NFL? Is he going to go to the Broncos, then go to the Salt Lake Stallions, and then not play CFL football ever in his life because he decides I'm Chapman and I'm out, right? Those things don't happen in a lot of other sports, and so it is very tough on CFL drafts. The availability of information on a lot of the guys who will get drafted it's not plentiful like it is in the NFL, where you have multiple people working for multiple independent of teams, organizations whose sole job it is to evaluate draft picks. PFF can put out a draft guide of 300 players, in-depth analysis of every play they've ever made in college. And you go, if we had it in CFL, we'd all be smarter fans. But in the meantime, we just get to go, you didn't take Lacombo? F. You get an F because you didn't take the Saskatchewan guy. You didn't take Kyle Borsa in round 2. You get an F. We get to play with it. I love it because for me it creates a permanent signpost of, man, I loved that guy. I loved Lavelle Hawkins in 2015 with the BC Lions, and then he turned out to be, he left the game after that. Or I was in love with this guy and it did not turn out the way it was. I love that as it checks me to make sure I go, oh, okay, well, I thought he was going to be good and he was atrocious. Mm-hmm. What happened? What's wrong with me? How can I get better at what I do? Go ahead.
Numbers. I'll just give you a quick number thing too here with the first picks overall. So go back and look at those first picks overall in the CFL from 1990. There were 31 of them. There'll be 32 as of tomorrow.
Yeah.
But the number 1 pick overall, 20 of them you would consider underachieved big time. And that really doesn't change. I mean, the overall number changes a little bit for the NFL. The NFL, I looked at it, and again, there's some subjectivity in this decision, but of the 32 picks from 1990 in the NFL, I would say 12 of those picks drastically underachieved if you're the first pick overall in the NFL. I mean, you're talking about a 50-50 proposition when you add up the two leagues. about the first pick overall.
Well, let's do this. 2018, Mark Chapman to Hamilton, disaster. Never played in the CFL. We believe he's retired from football. 2017, Faith Akakity to Winnipeg, first overall. Played one season, and they cut him because he was not very good. Josiah St. John, 2016. Yikes. Alex Mateus, I believe Alex is retired already. Went to Calgary. I think his injury forced it. Pierre Lavertu, Lyndon Gaydosh, Ben Heenan, phenomenal player, out of the game now. Enoch Mwamba, there's a first overall pick. Shamari Williams. Yep. Oh, boy. Simeon Rotier, Dylan Barker, Chris Bauman, Adam Braidwood, Miguel Robidet, Wayne Smith. Back to 2004. And that was the team that had the first pick. I said I don't want any part of being a GM who's responsible for the CFL draft, because those are 17 picks. Well, those are 15 picks by super qualified, very intelligent people, and they are a disaster. That's how hard it is.
Yeah, and the CFL draft is more challenging than any pro sports draft because of all the elements that you mentioned. And so when I look at it, I go back to guys that have been very successful at it. I think Jim Pop back in his days in Montreal, very successful in the draft, especially in the late picks. I mean, when you consider guys like Ryan Bombin, Luc Brodeur-Jordan.
Sixth rounder,
Yeah, sixth rounder in 2008, and a guy who all-star, perennial all-star, Josh Burke. Scott Flory even was a third-round pick in 98 at the U of S up there. And he, again, those late picks, those late rounds, offensive linemen. And again, John Hufnagel in Calgary is a guy, since his return to the CFL, has done a pretty good job in that draft as well. And you know that in every single year that Hufnagel's been back in Calgary, he's picked at least around 2 or 3 on average offensive linemen. And if you go back and look at his last, 9 drafts, 20 offensive linemen, a lot of them, 10 of them, in fourth round or lower, and 5 or 6 of that group, all-stars. So it's a great challenge for GMs, and all the players that you mentioned were all rated high coming into those draft years. That's why they went number 1 overall.
Yep.
And they are great football players. But to speculate on who will make it and who not, it's hilarious. The only other topic of discussion that I think is sort of as irrelevant to real world is when we talk about some of the high-paying sports like the NFL and the NBA, and we say, that free agent's worth $30 million, but not $35 million. And I start to think, are we really saying that out loud, that a player's worth $30 million, but not $35 million?
Absolutely.
Come on. That's just, it's ludicrous to be talking about that like we're serious. I mean, the guy's making $30 million. How much is enough? Damn,
from that perspective, no. But as far as a percentage of the salary cap that my team has to spend, yeah. But whether a guy's worth 30, how much money do you need? Take that argument and shove it. Because come on, people deserve to get paid what they're worth. That's it.
Yeah, what the market will bear, right?
Yeah. Patrick Mahomes, 45, cool. How it affects the cap, how Connor McDavid's salary affects the Oilers cap, that's an interesting conversation. But the stuff about Connor shouldn't make 12.5 because he doesn't deserve it because teachers, go away.
Yeah, like exactly. Like in Patrick Mahomes, $45 million, sure, that's no problem.
Yeah.
Okay, I get it in your fantasy league. I get it against your cap. I get it against your under the umbrella of I'm going to play GM for a second, see how I would manage this cap. That's all fun stuff. And I get that. Honestly, I in fact, it's interesting to listen in on.
Yeah.
But I just think it's hilarious. Like, he's worth 45, but not 47.
I wouldn't go to 47. I'd kick him out of bed. I'd kick him out of bed for eating crackers at 47. Yeah, no, it's nuts. It's nuts.
Silly.
546. Glenn Suter's worth millions to us. We love it. We love it. We'd pay him less. No, we couldn't. We couldn't pay him less. We're going to talk about how we think Jeremy O'Day has done. This coming up on his 3rd draft. He's got some things in his style that I absolutely love from a football perspective and from a nerd perspective as well. We will discuss that as we continue. Fine tailored suits on the Sports Cage on 620 CKRM. Suits What's your impression of how Jeremy O'Day has managed, one, GM duties, and two, the draft so far in his Rider career?
Yeah, I think he's done well, and since he's sort of taken control of that, which is sort of later in his tenure. I mean, when he had Chris Jones making the choices and the picks, and pretty much all the football decisions, that he had a different role at that time. But I like his approach, and again, I'm not basing that on how many Saskatchewan stars have emerged. It's too early to know that, but if you have a system that you take a look at with all the different variables that are involved in the Canadian football draft, and you stick with your system and take the input from your coaches. So I don't think Jeremy O'Day, for instance, and I agree 100% with this aspect, is I don't think he falls in love with test scores and how much you bench press and those kind of things. They're part of the picture, yes. But if you fall in love with a player because he tests off the charts, boy, I've seen many examples of guys that can bench press the entire gym, and then you get them on the field and they're not ready and they can't play on the next level. So I think you got to be careful not to fall in love with those kind of test scores and things. And I'm not sure, and I don't think he's one of those guys.
Yeah. He had an availability today, and he answered all the questions that we had for him. And one thing I'd asked him in 2019 was how he approaches his mock drafting. When they're in the room, they're trying out, okay, well, what will they pick? And they go through a whole draft a few times and go, okay, well, what guys are we likely to get? He was talking about that today, and I asked him, hey, do you still do it where you guys go through the mock draft, but you, Jeremy O'Day, do not pick for the Riders? You have the rest of your guys, your assistant GM, your coaches, pick for you. And he's like, yeah, we do. And I won't pick because in future drafts, guys then will not pick the guy I picked to try to make me feel good. I'll get more of their honest opinion. And it just struck me in that moment that this is another of so many examples that O'Day does where he fights against biases that we all have, and he fights against tendencies and traditions that we all just kind of fall back on. He doesn't want his coaches just picking the guy Jeremy wants to make Jeremy happy. We are getting rid of a real anchoring bias that we all have of, once I'm on this guy, I'm always on this guy. That's a bias that we all have. We don't look at everything else around that guy. I thought that's fantastic. That's a real... You're addressing fallible humanistic properties that we have. Last year, he takes Neville Gallimore in the 8th round, a guy who the Dallas Cowboys selected. We asked, well, why Gallimore and why not another guy? O'Day said, we looked at the guys who were available and thought of the value they could bring, and then we looked at the probability that Gallimore was available and the value that he would bring, and when you look at it that way, we chose Gallimore. And I thought, well, there's a guy doing probabilities and using sort of a mathematical formula to go, this guy's going to be a 1. He's 100% available. This guy's 5% available, but he could be a 50. Just random numbers. You know what? Let's take a shot on that. And I thought, perfect. You weigh it out like that and you go, this is the guy we're taking because he is more value even though he probably doesn't come. I love so many things that he says and does in his job.
Well, I certainly like the fact that he picks in their mock situation for like another team would be picking. So that allows the coaches to then, you get a real sense of who they would go for, who
Freedom,
they
yeah.
pick. And so you can have those discussions after that mock scenario and find some common ground. And the other thing is your picks are on the clock. So, you've got to be ready for a lot of different scenarios to make sure you get the pick done in time. But I think with the Canadian draft, if I'm sitting there, I'm looking at the different variables and saying, I'm probably going to start with the best available player at that pick, regardless of position, except for O-line. So
okay,
I'm looking for O-line late in the draft that many of the so-called draft experts have rated lower, not because you might lose them for 3 years. I want guys that are going to come to camp first of all. So my risk assessment is going to weigh heavier on the players that I really think I have a good chance of bringing to training camp and actually being part of it. I mean, in all pro sports now, for a GM to plan 4 years down the road is optimistic thinking.
Yeah.
In the world of pro sports, when you think of how quickly there's turnover there. So you might not get a chance to realize 4 years down the road what that pick even could have done. But I'm going best athlete, and I'm always looking for O-line. Again, I'll pull that from John Huffnagel, who after round 3 is always taking 2 O-linemen there. And lo and behold, because you can't coach size, those guys learn the game and they become all-stars, and you have a chance to develop them. They go under the radar because they were rated low. I think picking futures I would put less weight in that. If a kid is going to be back in the NCAA and there's a real good chance that you won't see him for 2 or 3 years, my risk assessment goes way up with that player. And not because, again, they're all good football players. I'm just talking about getting the guys in camp, the best athlete. They could be your next asset, like Nick Dembski. Nick Dembski became a star with Winnipeg. He was drafted and played his first couple of years as he was learning the game in Saskatchewan. But that becomes an asset that you can move to another team and fill a hole that you might have at that time on your team. So I'm looking best athlete, best football player available, regardless of position, with a strong push for O-line, especially in the later rounds, if they're flying under the radar. That number 1 O-lineman, I'm not going to go crazy and get caught in the fabricated competition that is scouts talking about the top 4 or 5 players. I'm not going to fall into that.
Yeah.
And I don't think Jeremy O'Day does either.
It's Bill Belichick gets a lot of love for. He always wants to pick up lower picks, and he wants to get more picks. And I just go down the list and see Shane Bergman, Mike Filer, Brad Erdos, Ryan Bomben, Patty Neufeld, 5th round pick in 2010. Nonstop. John Gott was a 5th round pick, for crying out loud. Luc Brodeur-Jourdain, who you mentioned. There's so much value. Get lower picks. Just bring in more bodies, and you're going to strike, because the CFL draft is it's an absolutely imperfect science. Suits, thank you, my friend. We got to bail. Great to talk to you. We'll have you on Thursday.
Yeah, watch the draft on TSN tomorrow night. Farhan and Dwayne will do a great job. Dwayne Ford's our guy there, and I love it. And then we'll talk on Thursday.